The Trump administration dropped a major indictment just a few weeks ago. That indictment was against the Southern Poverty Law Center, or the SPLC for short. The SPLC is a nonprofit based in Montgomery, Alabama that, according to his website, is meant to be a catalyst for racial justice in the South and beyond, working in partnership with communities to dismantle white supremacy, strengthen intersectional movements, and advance the human rights of all people. And they specialize in civil rights and public interest litigation, lawfare. And they're not shy about it. The SPLC was founded by two civil rights lawyers, Morris Dees and Joseph Levin, in 1971. Their early lawsuits, plenty of them justifiable, sought to weed out remnants of segregation and the like. But they learned a really valuable lesson through those early lawsuits. Lawsuits are a good way to make the price of hate too costly to bear. By the late 1970s, they were putting this strategy to work against the KKK, against the KKK's local affiliates, and other organizations too. And in the 1980s, shortly after the SPLC started going after the KKK even firebombed the SPLC offices at one point, it started to proactively monitor the KKK and other hate groups. And they called it the Intelligence Project. And the KKK project was also called Klan Watch. Klan Watch and the Intelligence Project, the proactive monitoring of these groups to bring lawsuits, basically formed their flagship product that you might be familiar with today, which is the SPLC's hate map. They just dropped a new version of that hate map this week. And their work ultimately bankrupted the KKK back in the early days of the SPLC, which, hey, no love for the KKK here, obviously. But you can see the moral hazard that comes with this territory. It's a very seductive power. And what makes it so seductive, being able to destroy your enemies through lawsuit, is that there's a certain kind of righteousness to it, especially if your enemy is the KKK. But what if, instead of just going after the KKK or similar groups, we broadened the definition of hate to encompass more and more and more organizations? Organizations we could target with lawsuits. Lawsuits meant to destroy those organizations. It's a very powerful temptation, and it's a temptation that the SPLC has seemingly given into. Today, the SPLC's hate map includes over 1,200 different groups, and these groups fall under over 24 different ideological categories, ideologies that range from neo-Nazi, white supremacists, and Holocaust denialism to anti-immigrant, radical traditional Catholicism, conspiracy propagandists. And if a group isn't covered by one of those ideologies, the SPLC also has a category called general hate. Safe to say, the SPLC is no longer just tracking the KKK and a handful of other groups. The hate groups listed on its website include Moms for Liberty, PragerU, and even the Alliance for Defending Freedom. And this isn't just some group putting names on a naughty list. The SPLC has deep pockets, something around $800 million in assets. The SPLC can destroy you, and it has destroyed people. But now, the Trump administration is cracking down. The grand jury indictment charged the SPLC with 11 counts of wire fraud, false statements to a federally insured bank, and conspiracy to commit concealment money laundering. And some of these allegations directly relate to the SPLC's hate monitoring and all of the dangers that go along with that project. According to the indictment, in the 1980s, around the time when the SPLC was starting to put together its hate watch apparatus, the SPLC started creating a covert network of informants in groups like the KKK or other extremist groups. And other individuals were also infiltrating those groups on behalf of the SPLC. Now, the indictment says that this activity was happening without the SPLC donors' knowledge, that actually some portion of their donation to stop hate was actually being used to fund individuals associated with those hate groups and prop them up. According to the indictment, the SPLC has funneled more than $3 million in donated funds to individuals in the KKK and other groups between the years of 2014 and 2023. So the SPLC appears to be getting a little bit of a taste of their own medicine. But how strong is this case that the DOJ has brought against the SPLC, and where is this all going? Well, joining us this week on the Signal Sitdown is the man who wrote the book for conservatives to understand the SPLC. And that's none other than Daily Signal's senior editor, Tyler O'Neill. His book on the SPLC, titled Making Hate Pay, is out with a second edition in light of all the recent revelations of alleged corruption. We hope you enjoy. Before we get into this week's interview on the Signal Sitdown, ring that bell to get notifications on future Signal Sitdown content. Hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you may be joining us. And then while you're at it, please leave us a 5-star review and comment who you'd like to see on a future episode of the Signal Sitdown. Remember, it's your government. It's your country. And together, we're taking it back. Without further ado, here's the interview. Tyler O'Neill, welcome to the Signal Sitdown.
Thanks, Bradley. Glad to be here.
Of course. And, I see you every day, so you're not that special of a guest, but you're super special this week because you wrote this book a few years back, and it's now out with a new edition called Making Hate Pay, The Corruption of the Southern Poverty Law Center. The Southern Poverty Law Center has been in the news lately. There has been an indictment that has been handed down by the Department of Justice after it put its argument in front of a grand jury against the SPLC. You've been covering this. Of course, you've been covering the organization for a long time, but you've been covering the specific indictment since it came out in April. What is in this indictment? What are the allegations?
Yeah, I mean, this has very shocking allegations. They're shocking in one sense in that, you have this organization that's associated with the civil rights movement that has allegedly been paying members of the Ku Klux Klan, been reimbursing people for materials used in cross burnings, for, paying for KKK hoods. I mean, this is the sort of thing you can't make up. This is like a Babylon Bee headline. And yet we even saw in the superseding indictment this last week that an SPLC employee was literally in bed with a neo-Nazi informant. So that's how far off the reservation this group has gone. But all these claims are essentially to say the SPLC is allegedly engaged in wire fraud. It claims to be fighting racism and white supremacist groups, but the money that it uses to raise from donors to supposedly fight those groups, it actually funnels back into those activities. And this is, according to the indictment, a way of propping up hate so as to keep the donor money flowing.
So how much money has the SPLC spent on these types of informants in the last few years?
So the indictment goes from 2010 to 2023 and says it's $4.1 million. Now, that's a small chunk of change looking at the SPLC's overall assets, upwards of $800 million, and their endowment of something like $740 million. But it still represents a pretty sizable investment of money in what the DOJ suggests is this scam to prop up the very hate the SPLC claims that exist to oppose.
Right. I'm sure it's a money multiplier situation where you spend $1 million on some kind of KKK activism as the Southern Poverty Law Center, a group that ostensibly fights for racial justice, and then you're able to make $100 million off of whatever insane incident is precipitated by that funding. So, of course, there's been a lot of pressure on the Trump administration, particularly since the death of Charlie Kirk, to go after some of these left-wing organizations that use its dollars to propagate chaos, whether that's Antifa or, as we're finding out, potentially the Southern Poverty Law Center too, right? This is what's in the indictment, these allegations, is that they are propping up this type of activity on the extreme right rather than the extreme left. But
Right.
as a left-wing group, like there's been a lot of pressure on the Trump administration to go after these left-wing groups. Why do you think the SPLC came under the fire of the Trump Justice Department?
Yeah, I mean, let me count the reasons.
Yeah.
One of the biggest reason, so the SPLC claims they have this big filing where they're saying this is vindictive prosecution. The Trump administration doesn't like what we say, and therefore they're going after us in court. Now, there is a superficial plausibility to that, partially because we saw in the Biden administration this repeated use of the Southern Poverty Law Center. I think we all remember the anti-Catholic memo where the Richmond FBI office, working with other FBI offices, comes up with this memo saying that radical traditional Catholics are a threat to America. And their main source for this is, surprise, surprise, the Southern Poverty Law Center. And the SPLC is very useful for the left because it gained its reputation by suing Klan groups into bankruptcy. Now it puts mainstream conservative and Christian groups on a hate map with Klan chapters, suggesting, and it claims that this map reveals the infrastructure upholding white supremacy. That infrastructure just so happens to include groups like Turning Point USA and the Family Research Council and Focus on the Family and Alliance Defending Freedom. These are very mainstream conservative and Christian organizations that are put on the map essentially for the sin of disagreeing with the SPLC. But in the Biden DOJ, what we saw was the SPLC brought in to train prosecutors on the anti-LGBTQ plus movement, to work with Kristen Clark, who is the head of the Civil Rights Division in the Biden DOJ. And so thankfully, under President Trump, we have a new sane Department of Justice that comes out and says, look, we're not working with the SPLC anymore. You had FBI Director Kash Patel make a very important statement after the assassination of Charlie Kirk, that the FBI will not rely on the Southern Poverty Law Center under his watch. And so that is used as evidence by the SPLC to say that this is a vindictive prosecution. But if I'm looking at this situation and I know what I know about the SPLC, and I think most Americans can understand, this is an organization that vilifies conservatives and Christians and goes to various sectors of polite society and says, you need to debank, you need to blacklist, you need to deplatform any of these organizations. And the SPLC is the center of demonizing conservatives and Christians in our civil discourse right now. And so the FBI distancing itself from the SPLC is an important step in the right direction to restoring trust with the FBI. So there's a very weird sort of, almost Orwellian nature to this, where the SPLC is taking that positive step of removing bias, a horrible bias from the FBI, and saying this proves bias against us when they're facing criminal charges.
So what you're kind of laying out here, the reason that the DOJ went after the SPLC for this type of activity, right, is they saw the goods, they had a strong enough argument to get a grand jury to indict, et cetera, et cetera. But the SPLC, in a way, is a victim of its own success, that it was so ingrained and so prominent amongst the left and amongst left-wing organizations, amongst left-wing governments when the left is in control of government, that it made itself kind of an obvious and easy target for the Trump administration looking to act against these left-wing purveyors of discontent and chaos.
Yeah, I'd say obvious. I'm not entirely sure I'd say easy.
That's true. No, I mean, they have deep pockets.
Yeah, not only do they have deep pockets, they have very smart lawyers. I've been going through the filings from the SPLC, and they're very smart in stringing together a strong argument in fighting back against what the DOJ says.
So the vindictive prosecution thing you think is a little far-fetched, but
yes,
there is an argument here for the SPLC to defend itself. And so unpack that for us a little bit. I know I interrupted you here, but what are the strengths and weaknesses of this case being brought against the SPLC? What are the SPLC lawyers drawing attention to beyond just this is vindictive when they actually get down to the brass tacks and the meat and potatoes of the lawsuit?
So that's the interesting thing. They don't really get down to the brass tacks and the meat and potatoes of the specific claims. What they do, so their overall narrative is, we didn't fund the Klan. We didn't fund them. We were funding informants who were trying to take down the Klan. And of course, that argument also has a superficial plausibility. The SPLC got attacked. Their offices were firebombed in the early 1980s. And that's one of the things that led them to create this informant program. There are also cases where SPLC claims information from the program led to criminal indictments against members of extremist groups. This organization called Atomwaffen Division is one that they constantly bring up because there they got one of the members convicted under a previous DOJ for actually planning a violent attack. But the substance of the indictment, the real purpose here, why the DOJ is going after them, is not those uses of the informant program that arguably made sense. It's the other ones. It's where the SPLC seems to have put more money behind an informant in a way that also propped up the hate so that they could fundraise off of it. So you have multiple situations where an SPLC informant is, and this is unbeknownst to donors, unbeknownst to the audience, that this person is an informant. The SPLC has an extremist file drawing attention to this person in the white nationalist movement and saying, look, this person is evil. Meanwhile, that person is on the SPLC payroll. That, sets off alarm bells to me. And there are other situations where the SPLC is accused in the indictment of giving money, paying for a cross burning. I mean, reimbursing people. So this is how it works.
The receipt gets submitted. It's wood, nails,
kerosene,
one lighter.
Exactly. And the SPLC apparently paid that bill. And so, when you're looking at this indictment and saying,
the expense file was construction. Construction, and then in the kerosene section, it's destruction.
Yeah. There you go. They're like an arsonist, or like a fireman who moonlights as an arsonist, or like an exterminator who plants rats in his neighbor's house to justify his own services. That's what the indictment is claiming, and to that specific claim, the SPLC has, to my knowledge, never really given a response. They've pleaded not guilty, and they'll get their day in court. And I'm very curious to see when they actually have to get down to brass tacks, how they defend those things. Because I understand, if they have this informant program for the situations where they actually had informants, I mean, it's weird for a nonprofit to be doing this, but also it's like, if they're using it as informants and not as a secret way to prop up hate, that is more acceptable.
So what's the weaknesses of the DOJ? Like this is a very open legal question on whether or not the DOJ can get this thing across the line. What are some of the weaknesses involved in the case that they've brought against the SPLC?
Yeah, the biggest weakness that a lot of analysts have brought up is that it's very difficult to prove wire fraud. So the wire fraud charges, you have to plead a scheme, you have to prove that they intended to carry out that scheme, and proving someone's mental state is a very difficult, high legal hurdle. But that said, the easier thing to prove here, and to my mind, is the bank fraud charges, where they have, you can't make this up. You have statements from an SPLC employee saying, I am the owner and proprietor of X entity. And then later on, a few years later, the SPLC CEO signs an affidavit saying these bank accounts were opened for the purposes of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And immediately there you have direct, clearly conflicting statements to an FDIC insured bank. That's the sort of thing, this is like tax evasion, like the basic boring charge that gets somebody like Al Capone actually in prison. And to my knowledge, so long as the documents are accurately cited, and I have no reason to say that they're not, those charges are extremely serious, and it's going to be very hard for the SPLC to wiggle their way out of them.
So this is allegedly, what the
Yes, all of this.
what the SPLC has been doing with its money. It's been funneling it up to the tune of millions of dollars to KKK operatives who are quote unquote going to take down the organization by doing cross burning somehow. But according to the SPLC, let's play devil's advocate, or I'm going to ask you to play devil's advocate. What does the SPLC say it does with its money and its resources and its talent?
Yeah, so it says that it monitors hate groups, and it publishes this annual hate map. I actually just published the latest one this morning. And this hate map goes through, it has a bunch of Klan chapters, neo-Nazi groups, various, and it's always important for me to say whenever I mention this, that all the iterations of things like the Klan, the Klan in the 1920s, even the 1950s, was a serious, deadly force in America. This was a terrorist organization, is the quintessential hate group. Today's Klan organizations are, barely extant things. Like even in the 1980s, when the SPLC was suing these Klan groups into bankruptcy, the lawyers said that it was so easy to sue them into bankruptcy, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. Because newsflash to the left, America is not racist the way that it was in the 1920s or even the 1950s. We've moved on. There have been real serious successes from the civil rights movement. And, that's not to say that there weren't, abuses on either side. But the important thing is America today is nothing like the hateful image that groups like the SPLC try to present it as. So
right. They would like you to believe that the Klan is just as big of a threat now as it was, prior to the Grant administration coming in and running them out of town. Yeah.
Well, that's why you want to why you should send the money.
Yeah, and it's one. It shows the map of the United States with all the red dots, and the red dots are drawn big enough towards like absurd numbers. An absurd amount of the country is lit up in this red. Pins of all these different hate groups. There's over 1,000 of them. How many are there?
Yeah, 1,200 in the latest one.
1,200 hate.
So what they do, they used to say that they were all hate groups. Now they have hate and anti-government extremist groups. So they have about 500 hate groups and then about 700 anti-government extremist groups. And of course, one of the anti-government extremist groups that makes up a very sizable portion of the map is Moms for Liberty in all their local chapters.
So how did that happen? How did they make that move from hate group? I know that they abused the definition of hate. You've made that very clear. But how did it go from just hate groups to anti-government groups? That has nothing to do with hate.
So what they claim two things. And, you asked me to play devil's advocate. I'll do that a little bit here. They say that these groups, through their rhetoric or policies or official statements, are vilifying and demonizing people of certain protected classes. That's what a hate group is in their mind. And then when it comes to anti-government, it's a broader category. And the interesting thing here is that even, not playing devil's advocate anymore, even on their own terms, they're doing monkey business with these terms, because they say typically they vilify people typically for their immutable characteristics, but they have anti-immigrant hate groups on the map. Last time I checked, immigration status isn't an immutable characteristic. And so first, this was part of Klan Watch, and it was a newsletter that they released in the 1980s, 1990s, and then it became Hate Watch, and then they started publishing their hate map around the year 2000.
And this is, I'm sorry, all of this is growing. Klan Watch, Hate Watch, that newsletter / apparatus is growing in tandem with the Intelligence Project.
Yes, it's part of the Intelligence Project.
A precursor to the infiltration money that we've seen be a part of this indictment now.
Yes. So that infiltration aspect, the informant program, is part of the Intelligence Project. And the SPLC, to be clear, does more than just, monitor extremism. It also advocates for specific things, some of which, it's funny, they get their 1-2 punch. they have an education arm called Learning for Justice. It used to be called Teaching Tolerance, and then tolerance wasn't woke enough for them. So now it's Learning for Justice. But Learning for Justice pushes critical race theory, transgender ideology, those things. And then on the other hand, they have the Intelligence Project, which puts out a hate map that says if you oppose critical race theory or transgender ideology in school or in other venues, then you're a hate group. So they get this really powerful, they get you on both ends. They're advocating for something, and then if you oppose that thing, they're advocating to deplatform, deboost, demonetize you. And so it's a very effective political strategy. Unfortunately, it's too effective. People don't realize how they're being lied to, because this political smearing, it emerged over time. But in 2010 is a big watershed year, because that's when they decided to put conservative Christian groups on the hate map for the sin of opposing LGBT activism. And they've long said that we're not anti-Christian. We don't target people for their religious beliefs. We target them because they systematically vilify LGBTQ people. But at what point does, you coming out and saying, look, I don't care what your sexuality is, I want to preach the gospel to you. By the way, I believe, because I'm a Christian, that homosexual activity and transgender ideology are sinful and they're wrong and they're not part of God's design. I want the best for you. Therefore, I don't want you to follow this. At what point does that become anti-LGBTQ hate? And that's where we've seen this, like the SPLC, they started with the suggestion. And early on, they make no bones about, they say, we're not putting focus on the family on the hate map. And then they have this section on their website where they say, people have called us anti-Christian. We're not. Here's the evidence why we're not anti-Christian, because we don't put focus on the family on the hate map. And then lo and behold, that evidence disappears from their website sometime last year abouts, and then they add focus on the family to the hate map. That's why I feel perfectly justified to say they're anti-Christian by their own standards. Now, of course, in the hearing today, we had Democrats come out with a video where you had left-leaning pastors constantly saying like, oh, the SPLC isn't anti-Christian. They care for the least of these. They do important things. And I'm like, well, sure, maybe on the side, they do a little bit of work that might help society, but their fundraising apparatus and their reason why they're relevant in our society today is their systematic defaming of good conservative people. And one of the groups that they systematically defame is conservative Christians who stand for the truth of the Bible.
Yeah, and you mentioned, they've it's not just hate groups anymore, that this hate watch / influence project that culminates in their flagship product, this hate map, the aperture of ideologies just keeps expanding. And you said, oh, anti-immigrant, that's not an immutable characteristic. Last time I checked, they're making a lot of assumptions saying that LGBTQ is an immutable characteristic. That's another thing, right?
Right. And it's debatable.
Yeah. And so you have all these different shifts. The aperture widens and widens and widens. When does anti-government come into the play? I'm sorry, I interrupted you before when you were talking about it.
Yeah.
And how do you make sense of that with the anti-immigrant edition and the anti-LGBT edition? And then I also think that they have something on their hate map that just is a category called general hate.
They
which
do.
Is like, in case we don't have it labeled yet, you can just fall into the general
the things
hate.
like hate music.
Right.
Yeah, they have hate music on there.
So how does it expand so rapidly over the last few decades? I mean, I guess it could go back to the 80s. You know the timeline better than I do.
Well, so this really reveals what I refer to often as woke ideology, where you have critical race theory, and Christopher Rufo is fantastic on this, tracing the history of these ideas back. But essentially, they took Marxism and they said, look, it isn't just about class warfare. It's also about racial warfare. It's also about identity warfare. And they have this wonderful catch-all term called intersectionality, where they say if you're a black person, you're inherently oppressed or whatever. If you're a black woman, you're more inherently oppressed. If you're a black trans woman, you're more inherently oppressed. And if you're, you just go down the list. If you're a black, trans, immigrant, feminist, like all these things.
Right. Even if you went to the Met Gala, if you are a model quadriplegic trans black woman, you are the most oppressed.
Right. Well, you have this intersectional Olympics sort of thing that goes on. But the whole point is it's this weaponization of empathy. And so we all, do feel for people who really do fall through the cracks and have struggles in our system. Thank God for capitalism and free markets and, a government that has been addressing real systematic problems in the past. Now we have a very fair society. Honestly, maybe not fair for the people who are not considered oppressed by the left anymore. So, there's another question for you. But the intersectional ideology brings all of this together. So the left can say, and the SPLC is one of the tips of the spear on this, they can say, look, America is still systematically racist. Never mind that we had the progress of the civil rights movement. We were founded in slavery. That's a black mark on our record, and we will never be able to expunge it. We need constant revolution to overthrow it. And this is a really effective political tool if they can convince people of this nonsense, because it means that if you oppose them, if you oppose any act of their radical remaking of society, you're supporting white supremacy. And that's how they justify it. But it's not just the white supremacy, it's not just the racial angle. They have the LGBT angle, they have the immigrant angle, they have all these different ways in which they say there's oppression, and we have to root out oppression.
Well, it's a really telling diagnosis of what the American regime actually is from the viewpoint of the left, from the viewpoint of the SPLC, right? If you are an anti-government group, the assumption is that the regime is purely operating off of the post-civil rights paradigm, which is disparate impact to its extreme, most illogical, the extreme conclusion of what disparate impact actually outlines. So they're saying that not only are these people anti-government because they're folksy libertarians, but really because they oppose the way in which the civil rights regime, which has largely taken over our government and a lot of its commanding heights institution, operates today. And so that's why you end up with Moms for Liberty, and you end up with PragerU, and you mentioned TPUSA, and all these different groups on there. They can be classified as some of these other ideologies, but they'd also be classified in that sense as anti-government as well, because it's against the operation of the administrative state, which drives its reason for being from this, perverted sense of what civil rights actually is. And this money, you mentioned, how much money does it have? How much?
Yeah, I think it's $820 million.
$820 million. So this organization, it's not like if they put you on the hate map, this is just a little tack and a corkboard.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
This is an organization that can destroy you. I mean, has it destroyed people?
Yes. So the SPLC, it doesn't just release this map, which would be bad enough. It also it has a history of systematically going to big tech, of going to financial institutions, of going to various places and saying, look, this effectively is a terrorist threat, these hate groups. You need to debank them, delist them, demonetize them, cut them off from polite society. And they get success on this in some ways. It's a little difficult to concretize, because you had companies like Amazon that used to exclude them from the Amazon Smile program. Now the big one is Benevity. Benevity is this go-between that connects companies with nonprofits. And so Benevity provides good, important services to like Fortune 500 companies and says, we want to help you make it easy for your employees to give money, to donate time, to help charitable causes. That's a good thing in general. But they use the SPLC's hate map to screen out potential nonprofits for these companies' employees to support. And so you have this systematic removal of conservatives and Christians from polite society. And it's driven by the Southern Poverty Law Center. It also led to, the most important two incidents to mention are the terrorist attack against the Family Research Council in 2012, where a man used the SPLC website. He said he found the FRC on the hate map, went to FRC, took a semi-automatic pistol and a bag of Chick-fil-A sandwiches, planned to shoot everyone in the building and smear a Chick-fil-A sandwich in their faces. And of course, the SPLC, thank God, the attack was largely foiled. The building manager, a man by the name of Leo Johnson, Leo the hero, he's named, he tackled this man to the ground and prevented this massacre. But, he suffered lifelong injuries in the process. The SPLC condemned the attack, but they kept the Family Research Council on the hate map.
They kept them there.
Yeah. And they also have kept Turning Point USA on the hate map shortly after they added Turning Point USA to the hate map last year. We all know what happened to Charlie Kirk. The man who allegedly murdered Charlie Kirk is also, according to prosecutors, saying that he wanted to silence Charlie Kirk's hate. And of course, that doesn't prove that the hate map directly inspired this violence, but I think it's very easy to say the SPLC is part of the overall environment that encouraged this man to take a shot at Charlie Kirk. And the SPLC, of course, condemned that attack too, but they've kept FRC on the hate map, or they kept Turning Point on the hate map. In fact, their report today that they released has a long section about how those evil conservatives are trying to infiltrate college campuses, and Turning Point USA naturally features largely in that.
So this is, just mind-boggling that you wouldn't reevaluate. It's all part of, as you said, a kind of a landscape where the definition of hate, the definition of harm, is completely running away from its original definition. And if everything is hate and everything is harm, you're in a very dangerous position as a country. And so Congress, in response, has hauled the SPLC head. He's the interim president. He's going to be leaving soon, Brian Fair, in front of Congress. You were watching the hearing all today. We're recording this Tuesday. What did Brian Fair have to say for himself and for the SPLC?
Well, he didn't say that much. Over and over again, Jim Jordan gave him an opportunity to respond to the claims in the indictment, and he always punted, essentially, to the attorneys and saying, oh, we're going to address that in court. We're going to address that in court, which, is an acceptable thing. But it's also interesting the way that when Democrats were asking him questions about it, he was willing to actually engage with them and give a little bit of an answer. So the long and short is Brian Fair was very slimy today in front of the Judiciary Committee. But there were a few things that came out that I thought were very notable to mention. One of them, it doesn't directly relate with the SPLC, but it kind of shows where their mentality is, because Jasmine Crockett, who lost her election and she's still in Congress, but she mentioned Alveda King, who's the niece of Martin Luther King Jr., was there testifying as a Republican witness, and she condemned the SPLC's attacks on conservatives and Christians. And Jasmine Crockett decided that she would get a dig in at Alveda King by saying that she's not a legitimate member of the King family. She doesn't really represent what Dr. King would say if he were alive today. And Jasmine Crockett mentioned two other members of Alveda King's family, and then didn't give Alveda King a chance to respond, suggested that Alveda King was the black sheep of the family, not a legitimate voice representing King. And thankfully, a Republican immediately went next and said, by the way, Alveda King, do you want to respond to this? And she did. And she said, look, Jasmine Crockett was making me out to be a bastard of the King family, but I'm a legitimate daughter. My parents are part of this family. And she said, look, we're a God-fearing family, and I love God. I love the Congresswoman. And while she's giving this response, Jasmine Crockett just leaves the room. She doesn't even give Alveda King the decency of listening to her response to her. And so that whole situation, this is a microcosm of what the SPLC does, because the SPLC suggests that the Republican Party, and actually this is what one of the Democrats responding to the SPLC said, was that the Republican Party is essentially an apparatus for the white supremacist movement. And this is the real irony of the SPLC calling groups like Moms for Liberty and Turning Point USA anti-government extremist groups, which they did again in releasing the hate map today, because Moms for Liberty equips moms to run for school board. Like there's very little anti-government about trying to get people who think like you to run for local elected office. But the reason why they're on there is because they say we will not co-parent with the government. They say parental rights come before public schools. And the SPLC, oh, how dare you suggest that public schools might be a problem? They oppose school choice. I mean, this is which is one of the big civil rights movements of our generation. I mean, if you want to help failing Black students, one of the most important things you can do is give them an opportunity to choose their schools and get out of some of these failing public schools. Anyway, the main point is, and now the SPLC, their big takeaway from the hate map today is that these extremist groups are infiltrating institutions, particularly the government. So who is more anti-government? The group of moms who are trying to get people to run for school board, or an institution like the Southern Poverty Law Center that defines hate so broadly that now it is trumpeting the fact that some members of the Trump administration are members of hate groups and therefore pushing hate in the federal government. If you ask me, the SPLC is a lot more anti-government than Moms for Liberty.
So this is all heading in a really dangerous and bad direction. It feels like the country can't support itself when it has, $800 million organizations propping up vast money networks and allegedly sowing all this chaos. Where does this tend towards? Where are we heading next with all of this stuff? Perhaps there's a court date already scheduled. But beyond that, I mean, what's the stakes of failure here to get a lasso on this left-wing nonsense, whether it's paying for informants for the KKK or Antifa riots? I mean, what are the stakes of failure here for common sense Americans?
Yeah, that's probably one of the most sobering questions, because increasingly I'm convinced that we're in the middle of an ideological war where, it's like the line between woke and based runs through every major institution. And like, it horrifies me, because I'm a member of the Anglican Church. I was baptized in an Episcopal church. The Episcopal Church has gone so far off the deep end that, and it's like, you look at across American institutions, the ideological gap is widening. And it's because the left has their laundry list of ideology and you have to be pure, and they have a stranglehold on that Democratic Party. And thank God we actually have a strong Republican Party now that's willing to respond and say, no, we don't listen to you. The GOP was so spineless for so long that the left isn't used to the right saying, no, we don't accept the basic premise of your ideology. We will fight for parental rights. We will fight for the natural family. We will fight for the things that are preserving America. But right now we're at loggerheads. And I don't know where this goes, because we remember long ago in our history when it seemed like both Republicans and Democrats wanted what's best for America. Now, Democrats are hitching themselves to an ideology that is driving them into the abyss, and that essentially wants America, as we know and love it, to die. I mean, that's when you're talking about a fundamental transformation, it's not keeping the character of our country the same. And they're not going to give up, and we shouldn't give up either. And unfortunately, I think so many Americans don't see the true nature of this threat. And you hear, you live your normal life. And I understand. I mean, I'm obsessed with politics. I don't think every American should be obsessed with politics. It's not always healthy. But I think we also have to realize that allowing the left to win is not just, it's not just people who are motivated by a different policy agenda. It's not just slightly higher taxes. It's these people want to redefine what it is to be a man and a woman. These people want to force men in women's prisons. They want men competing in women's sports. They want your children to hear that Sally can become Johnny and that it's a good thing for them to mutilate their own bodies. And they're not giving up. Like, we have a lot of really important successes that have been happening, and I'm very glad to see the Trump administration pushing aggressively many of these things, dialing back the insanity that Obama first really brought to our politics. And whoever follows Trump has to be aggressive in actually saying, no, we're not going to kowtow to the left. But if our politics keeps going back and forth and doesn't fundamentally change, both sides are growing increasingly frustrated for ideological reasons. And I pray for my country when I remember how unjust so much of our country is.
Tyler O'Neill, thanks for coming on the Signal Sitdown.
Thanks for having me, Bradley.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown. If you liked what you heard here today, be sure to hit like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever before you go. And we love your feedback. It really does help the show. So please remember to leave us a review and comment who you'd like to see on future episodes of the Signal Sitdown. It's because of your support and your interest and your engagement that allows us to continue this incredibly fun work. And together, we'll continue to expose how Washington really works and affect real change. We'll see you next time on the Signal Sitdown.